as we're going to begin our class about the Ramah, but we have to thank our sponsors. So a very special thank you to Shirley Zuck, who is sponsoring our shir tonight in memory of her father, Charles Soberman. And Shirley often mentions that I should know that in Toronto there are Sobermans with S and Zobermans with Z, and it's the same family. Yechiel Chaim ben Yerachmiel. The yahrzeit is actually this next week, 13th of Shvat. So thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Zuck family, for sponsoring. May the neshama of your father have an aliyah. So we are indeed very, very grateful. So we're studying the Ramah tonight. And David and Fran Wolf actually sent me some nice pictures from a visit of theirs to Krakow, where you see the Bet HaKnesset Chadash of the Ramah. You see that? And here, a very inspiring plaque, which I could just imagine standing there and be inspired. Mikubal etzlenu. There's a tradition by us, right? There's a tradition. They have a tradition there in Krakow. Asher al hamakom hazeh, at this location, right here. Amad haRamaz Zatzal, the Ramah, who we're going to be discussing tonight, stood, litpalel, to pray to the Almighty, velishpoch sicho lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to pour his heart in front of the Almighty. So you had the privilege, and I think a few people had the privilege of visiting that location. No doubt inspiring. So tonight we're going to hopefully develop a little bit of an appreciation of who exactly was the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles. And it's a figure that we are familiar with due to the fact that we always turn to Shulchan Aruch for guidance, and his ability to sense, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, his ability to sense that this text that was written by a great Sephardi rabbi in the land of Israel in the second half of the 16th century is really going to take off and become the guiding text for Jewish halachic practices, and realize that we can't ignore this text, even though it is problematic for us Ashkenazim because it follows the Sephardi traditions. So he realized that he has to put on a mapa, like a tablecloth, on top of the Shulchan Aruch, where he could, with respect, although the author, Rabbi Yosef Karo, tells us that you follow a specific practice, for us Ashkenazim, there's a different tradition. And with this text really brought Klal Yisrael together, because Ashkenazim and Sfaradim follow the guidance of Shulchan Aruch. And for the past 400 or 500 years, you define a halachic Jew by someone that follows the teachings in Shulchan Aruch. So we want to study a little bit about Rav Moshe Isserles. But what I would like to share with you, and the reason I chose him among the many great rabbinic authorities, in every field, when you want to describe to someone a success, you turn to the superstar, right? Lahavdil, when it comes to football. And you want to talk about a great quarterback. So you want to talk about a great quarterback, you compare them to Joe Montana, right? You can compare them to Jim Kelly. You compare them to one of the great figures in that field. And lahavdil, also in our circles, obviously, there are many great scholars, and we compare individuals or we get inspired by great Torah personalities. But what I would like to share with you is the fact that if a person would want to enter into the rabbinate, someone decides that he wants to serve as a rabbi, and they would ask me, what rabbinic personalities should I study, right? whose writings should I turn to for guidance to be a good rabbi, right? The perfect rabbi to the best of your ability, right? And on the top of my list, I would put Moshe Isserles. Try to emulate this great rabbi. Try to emulate him. Because when you go through his works, when you go through his writings, and you go through his responsa, you realize that there's an attitude, and it's a very healthy attitude for the successful spiritual guide. And that's what we're going to study here today, a little bit about his life and a few words about his writings. And hopefully we could develop an appreciation for why this is such an important person to become familiar with if you want to be that guide for the people of Israel. Now, to appreciate the story of Moshe Isserles from Krakow, you have to actually go back some 60, 70 years prior to his appearance. And you have to study a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Polak. Okay? Rabbi Yaakov Polak was born, believe it or not, in Poland, in Krakow. And at that time, in Krakow, in the second half of the 15th century, in 1470 and 1480, although there were Jews in Krakow, great yeshivot they did not have. And therefore, if you were a Torah scholar and you wanted to develop in your scholarship, you would travel to the West. You would travel to Germany. You would travel at times to Prague, to the great yeshivot there, because Poland did not have such institutions at the time. And Rav Yaakov Polak, the Polish young man, traveled to the great yeshivot and became a superstar. A great Torah scholar, married the daughter of a very wealthy woman in Prague, and had the following in his late 20s, a very significant following. Now, at one point, there was a major dispute among rabbis that related to a question called the miyun question. What is the miyun question? The Torah tells us that the father has the right to marry off a daughter, something that we have a very difficult time relating to in the modern world we live in the modern way we think, which it could be a good thing that we look at it as odd. But the fact is, it was part of tradition in the past, and it even existed in the 15th century, where a father would marry off a daughter. Now, it was probably something that was needed at the time. And the reason I know it was needed is because the rabbis even instituted a system where, God forbid, there was no father alive, that the mother or older brother could marry off the young lady. Now, due to the fact that it is rabbinic, in other words, when the father marries her off, that's Torah law. When a mother or an older sibling marries off this child, that is only considered a rabbinic marriage. And as a result, she has the right, the young lady, as she enters into maturity, she has the right to walk away from that marriage. And that is called in Talmudic literature as miyun. Lima'en, I'm not interested in this fellow. Now, the Talmud discusses it in detail. It appears that at some point in the beginning of the 15th century, the rabbis rejected the miyun. They saw some problems with it, and it became the custom. The custom became in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, or in Prague, that if a young lady was married off, and I'm talking about a girl, an 11-year-old, it sounds meshugah. If the 11-year-old was married off by her mother or older sibling, she's stuck. That became the tradition. Now, there was a story, and we have lots of details about this story, that there was a young girl, and the young girl was married to a fellow. His name was David Sinner. We even know his name. The young girl, as she reached maturity, realized he's no good. So she turned to rabbinic figures and said, I want out. And the rabbinic figure said, well, we're sorry. We have a tradition that dates back already a yovel, already 50 years. You're stuck. She wasn't too happy with it. Her mother was not too happy with it. So they turned to Rav Yaakov Polak. And they asked him, is there any way out? And Rav Yaakov Polak said, of course there is. The Talmud tells us she could say, I'm not interested. She should declare she's not interested, and she's free to go. And you have to realize that we're talking, this David center of ours didn't want to give a get. It was a complex issue. Rav Yaakov Polak took a stand for this young lady, and she was released. But due to the fact that many other rabbis disagreed with him, it created an issue for him to remain in the yeshivot in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, and he had to return back to Poland, to Krakow. He was a superstar. When he left, many of the bright students followed him. And as a result, he established a yeshiva in Krakow, Rav Yaakov Polak. And we have a whole list of traditions from Rav Yaakov Polak from the last part of the 15th century. And in many ways, the credit of Torah in Poland, and if you hear those words, Torah in Poland, I mean, that was the largest Jewish community before the Shoah, 3 million Jews in Poland. How many yeshivot, how many institutions, how many schools? You want to talk about the origins of Polish Jewry? It's Rav Yaakov Polak. Rav Yaakov Polak was a very wise man as well, because towards the end of his life, his students asked him, why are you not writing responsa? Why do we have nothing recorded from you? Why don't you write your opinions? And he said the following, I'm quite concerned that if I record it in a generation from now, they're going to continue following it, when reality is that when times change, you have to adapt things. There are things that we could be lenient. The next generation should be stringent. There are things we're strict with now. They should be lenient in the future. I don't want to lock the future in to my halachic practices. That's Rav Yaakov Polak. So Rav Yaakov Polak brings Torah to Poland, right? To Krakow, eventually Lublin. After his passing, there was a rabbi by the name of Reb Sholom Shachna, who becomes the head of Polish Jewry, the biggest Rosh Yeshiva, opens the yeshiva in Lublin. Reb Sholom Shachna. If you have ever met, I don't know if I've met anyone with the name Shachna, but it seemed to be a popular name. And what's interesting is that the origin of the name Shachna comes from the word Shechina, because when there's Shalom, when do you merit the presence of God, the Shechina? When you have Shalom. So that's Reb Sholom Shachna. So Reb Sholom Shachna, in the beginning of the 16th century, is the big Rosh Yeshiva, and he marries his daughter off, she was already an adult, not a child, to the greatest student who came from Krakow to study in Lublin, Reb Moshe Isserles. So Reb Moshe Isserles is a son-in-law to Reb Sholom Shachna. He returns to Krakow, and from 1550 on, leads the community in Krakow for over 20 years. He unfortunately dies in 1572. But at least you know a little bit of the history that Poland really is a new community. The Torah community of Poland was overall new. You know, I have on my shelf right here a sefer. This sefer, and it's very common for things that were printed in the past, that they would bind together more than one work, and sometimes it would be really apples and oranges. So in this case, what I have here is a binded book. The first half has the insights of the Gaon of Vilna on Mishlei, which is very nice. And the second half is a little pamphlet, really. It's a book, somewhere between a book and a pamphlet, written on Megillat Esther, called Mechir Yain, written by the Ramo, by Moshe Isserles. And it's really like a drush. I mean, he looks at Megillat Esther here as a metaphor for the journey of life. It has nothing to do with pshat. He tells us straight out in his introduction, I'm not giving you pshat, but just I view it as a metaphor of life. And he wrote this book, but he shares something very interesting as when he wrote this book. And he shares with us that it was in the year Shin Yud Vav, which is 1556. 1556. And unfortunately, they had to leave Krakow because of Ipush HaAvir. Because of Ipush HaAvir. The word Ipush is some kind of mold or stale air, due to the stale air of Krakow. You know what he was really referring to? A pandemic. It appears that there was some kind of pandemic in 1516, and they had to leave Krakow, and he settled in a place called Shidilov. Don't know exactly where it is. And he writes that he didn't have with him books, but he did have a Megillat Esther, so that's how he spent his pandemic. That's how he spent his isolation, writing on Megillat Esther. I just thought that was interesting because it's not a well-known work of his. Ramo is obviously well-known for his notes on Shulchan Aruch. Most of what we're going to be studying and discussing today comes from his responsa, from his tshuvot. And I have here an old tshuvot of Ramah. So the majority of information we'll discuss today relates to what he shares there. As Moshe Isserles was guiding Polish Jewry from Krakow, in Lublin, which was closer to Lithuania, there was another great rabbi and head of a yeshiva by the name of Rabbi Shlomo Luria Maharshal, another great Talmudic superstar. They were relatives, but whenever you read correspondence between them, you realize that there's some level of tension. There was a different philosophy and a different outlook between them, between Maharshal and Moshe Isserles. So in one of his responses, Maharshal apparently wrote a little bit of a harsh letter to Ramah, and Ramah responds to his cousin, or to this relative of his, Rabbi Shlomo Luria. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is information that I get from this tshuva, from this response of Moshe Isserles to Reb Shlomo Luria. And it appears that Reb Shlomo Luria was not happy that Moshe Isserles quotes to him from the works of Aristotle. And he says, Rabbi Luria says to Moshe Isserles, what is this Torah chogeres sak? You know, the Torah is wearing a sackcloth when great rabbis like you are focusing on the works of Aristotle. So Moshe Isserles has to defend himself. And he explains, listen, I don't analyze Aristotle in depth, but you know very well Maimonides studied him. And there's no question in my mind that if Maimonides could turn to him, I could at least quote anything Maimonides tells me from Aristotle. And then he shares with us the following. And this is, for me, one of the more fascinating insights, not just in the response of the Ramah, but perhaps in all of the responsa literature. Last week, we had the opportunity to talk a little bit about the rational Rambam. And in passing, we talked a little bit about the Kabbalists, the Mekubalim. And I think we had the ability to analyze a little bit what exactly are the Kabbalists. The Kabbalists had a tradition that Yecheskel had a vision of God, and it appeared to him in a form of a chariot. And those things that are described in Tanakh regarding the chariots, there was an oral tradition what they really mean. And that was handed down from generation to generation. And that's how you have Kabbalistic literature. Now, at some point, perhaps in the 10th or 9th century, there was a book that appeared. And this book was from the mystical school. And the work was known as Shiur Koma. Shiur Koma. You could translate that as the measurement of the height of the Almighty. So it is a book that describes the Almighty in very physical terms. So this became a great mystical text and was used very, very much by the Kabbalists of the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century. It was really a popular work. The Zohar later on took over that role of a work that is describing to us what God is about. Now, in that work, we are told that, by the way, don't view this just as mystical teachings that are theoretical, but rather, if a person studies this work called Shiur Koma, muftach lo shehu ben olam haba. Okay, kol hayodea Shiur Koma muftach lo. We all want that world to come. This text promises us that if we study the Shiur Koma, if you study these mystical teachings, you will get the world to come. We all want the world to come, so there were many, and this belief remains into the 21st century, that to really achieve that spiritual connection to God and thus merit a portion in the world to come, you better know Shiur Koma. You'll be muftach lo shu ben olam haba. Okay? Now, although for the Kabbalist, this was a very, very significant and primary text, what do you think Maimonides would say about such a work? A work that describes God in human terms and tells you that the way you acquire the world to come is by turning specifically to this text? Well, you don't have to guess what Maimonides would say, because Maimonides was asked, and he responds in a very short letter. So this is Rambam writing it towards the end of the 12th century. And he tells us, I don't see this as a Jewish text. And the best thing to do is limchok ze hasefer. If a person can erase it, velichrot zichra, and to get rid of it, the remembrance, meaning to purge it from the psyche and from the way of thinking of Jewish scholars, mitzvah Rabbi, it's a great mitzvah. Now, Maimonides did not succeed because it remained the go-to text. And there were always people that believe, you want olam haba, no shiur koma. Comes the Ramah, and the Ramah is defending himself for studying Aristotle, and really defending himself for studying natural science, because at the time, studying the works of Aristotle were really to understand the world as we know it. So Moshe Isserles writes to Rabbi Shlomo Luria, you know how I read that statement that if a person studies Shiur Koma, you merit the world to come? I understand it to mean that if a person studies the world and studies Mitziut HaTeva, if you study science, if you study nature, and you see in it the hand of God, you understand that there's such wisdom in a plant, there's such wisdom in a bird, there's such wisdom in a tree, and you recognize the fact that, that these bees are communicating with one another in a way that we don't really understand even how. When you see the wisdom in the world, and you recognize that this is the handwork of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the height of the Creator, and that's how you merit the world to come. Study science, says the Ramah, and see in it the hand of God. That is when you are muftach, you are ben olam haba. So it's incredible that he takes one of these most mystical statements and transfers it to knowledge of the world. He himself tells us that even though I know that the Mekubalim don't agree with my reading of that statement, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, both approaches, meaning the mystical approach and the rational approach, both the words of God. So I, of course, love that statement of the Ramah, and an important tool for someone that wants to inspire and teach others. And when you are ahead of the yeshiva and you see God, when you are studying in-depth texts of the Talmud, that's magnificent. No one can minimize that significance. But for someone who's going to be interacting with those who go out to the world, who understand the world, who appreciate the world, there is no question that these words of the Ramah, that when you see and understand nature and see in it the hand of an incredible God, you are going to merit as a result olam haba. I have no doubt that these are very important words that we could be inspired by a rabbi like Rabbi Moshe Isserles. One of the earlier tshuvot he wrote in 1550 related to a major controversy that erupted in Venice. I spoke about it a few times already. That in Venice there was an emerging new industry, new technology of the printing press, right? When up until the 16th century, the Torah scholar was studying from a scroll or from a handwritten manuscript or folio. 100 years later, right, by the beginning of the 17th century, rabbinic students were sitting with Talmud printed with more or less the same layout of a page that we have today. And I could just imagine that just as today, there are those who would say, how can you study Talmud on a screen on a computer? You know, the traditional way is studying with a book. I have no doubt that if in 1530 I would walk into a yeshiva, there would be those who were still studying with the old scrolls and books and handwritten manuscripts. And there were those who walked in with the latest edition of the printed Bamberg Talmud of Venice. And some of the more conservative ones would say, how can you be studying from a printed book when traditionally we only learn from manuscripts? I have no doubt that that was occurring. But it was a booming business in Venice of printing Hebrew books. We've talked in the past about the Bamberg Talmud of 1520. But in the late 1540s, there was a push to start working on Maimonides' works. And there were two printing houses, the Justinian printing house and the Bragadini printing house, which got into a major fight regarding the printing of the works of Maimonides. Moshe Isserles got involved and guided the people of Israel which one to purchase. Not one that I'm going to discuss in detail today, but I think if the Ramah is here to teach the rabbi, and really all of us, right, how to lead the people of Israel, what you sense in all his writings is a tremendous respect for minhag. If Klal Yisrael, if the Jewish community has a specific practice, even if you might have some level of difficulty defending it from traditional text, if Klal Yisrael is doing it, respect it. That's the Ramah. And there are many, many, many such examples. We find, for example, that there was a minhag that on Purim you cross-dress. Men would get dressed up as women, women as men. Some halachic authorities were extremely upset about it. It's a violation of a Torah commandment. Lo yilbash gever simlat isha. How can Purim override it? The Ramah, nevertheless, tells us this is a practice. He defends it. He shares it. Why Klal Yisrael does it? There is a fascinating discussion that relates to the Megillot, not Megillat Esther, but Shira Shirim, Kohelet, and Ruth, which we read on the Chagim. And the question is, if let's say you actually have it written in a scroll, would you make a bracha or not? So there's a major debate. And if you go through halachic literature, many authorities seem to indicate that a bracha should be made. But the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch notes that you should know, ha'am nahagu shelo levarech. Ha'am nahagu shelo levarech. And in his response, he clarifies that you should know that I did not write as I usually do v'nahagu, because when I write the word v'nahagu, I am sharing a practice that I believe that I could defend based on halachic literature. I specifically wrote v'ha'am nahagu and not v'nohagin because I saw people doing it. Although from the text it doesn't appear to be the proper practice, but if the people do it, hanachlem leIsrael, he defends what the people of Israel do. And this relates to many, many areas of minhag that the Ramah addressed. but also relates to practices. In other words, if the Jewish community is doing something, if everyone has a specific practice, don't start sharing stringencies and make issues. The community is doing it. Your responsibility as a rabbi is to defend it. And I'll give you a perfect example for such an issue. In Krakow, in the marketplace, you were able to purchase barrels of olive oil that originated in Italy. They were transported from different regions in Italy into Krakow, and people would buy their barrels of olive oil. There was an individual in Krakow that was spreading a rumor that before these barrels are filled in Italy with olive oil, to preserve the oil better, they would smear some lard within the barrel. And as a result, all olive oil in the marketplace is not kosher. So the Ramah, the rabbi, was asked to address the issue. So he tells us, you should know, lida'ati, according to my opinion, ein lachush ledavar zeh, no reason to concern yourself. He gives us 11 reasons. He presents 11 reasons why this individual is just making a tumult. There is no halacha concern. And he says, number one, it's nullified, meaning even if there is a little bit of flavor of the lard, it's clearly nullified in the olive oil. We're all familiar with the batel b'shishim, that if a drop of non-kosher substance falls into a liquid, if it's less than 60th, it's nullified. Number two, he shares with us the following, that even if it would be a little bit more, even if it would be touched more than a 60th, since everyone, when they taste olive oil, no one walks away saying, you know what? It tastes a little bit like lard. No one says that. The whole community is drinking it. The whole community is using it. That's a clear indication that there is no flavor at all from the lard. Now, he tells us that it's interesting that he also shares with us that, when this olive oil is imported here into this country, it's imported because the non-Jews in general, for fat and oil or cooking oil, they use fats from chicken and meat. When do they have a need to use that which is not derived from an animal? During Lent. They are makpid, says the Ramah, they're careful that during Lent there should be no derivatives of meat or chicken. We can rely on that as well, that there is no lard flavor in the olive oil. And then he tells us, you should know, you the machmer, I know that you yourself eat laksin, which is lax, dag shekorim laksin. And people have rumors regarding it as well. And his point was, rumors are not to guide us halachically. If Klal Yisrael is doing it, this is the practice that should be followed. I didn't obviously share every single detail from this tshuva, but here again, we have a rabbi that says Klal Yisrael does it, right? Don't create the issue because of something you've heard. And he makes it his business to defend the practice that is followed in the community. Now, his ability to be milamed schut, to go ahead and figure out a way to defend practices, goes far beyond those things which he believed are permissible. Even those things that he viewed technically as problematic, if there's a significant percentage of Jews who have a practice, we should try to defend it. Doesn't mean others should follow. And the fascinating example he talks about relates to non-kosher wine. Now, this is a very fascinating tshuva. There's a whole controversy about it. In Moravia, there was a presence of Jews who were lenient in drinking non-kosher wine. Not recommended, by the way, not at all. And I know from other sources that in northern Italy as well, there was a presence of very committed Torah Jews who were careful with all areas of halacha. They, for whatever reason, were lenient with non-kosher wine. Now, this is significant because in Talmudic times, non-kosher wine, meaning wine that was produced by a non-Jew, was not just prohibited in drinking and consuming, but you weren't even allowed to derive benefit from it. So true, over the years were more lenient and you're allowed to derive benefit. When before Xmas you get a gift of a nice wine, you could exchange it in LCBO for something else. But drinking non-kosher wine, we're all careful with it. Ramo was careful with it. But nevertheless, when he heard that in Moravia, they have a practice of drinking it, so he decided to pen a tshuva where he doesn't tell people to do it, but he tells people, listen, if they do it, let me explain to you why perhaps it would be permissible in their eyes, so we don't have to look down at them. So we don't have to consider them as Jews who are violating halacha. He felt the responsibility to do it. You know, there was a concern later that people will misunderstand this tshuva and start being lenient with non-kosher wine. So the printers in Amsterdam of the response of the Ramah in the beginning of the 18th century, Amsterdam was an interesting, a very fascinating community where you had already towards the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century some liberal forces. So whenever you have a community that there are those who are pulling to the more liberal side, there's a strengthening of a conservative element. And it seems that there were some conservative printers in the beginning of the 18th century. When they got to printing the response of the Ramah, they were so unhappy that the Ramah would have, as if the chutzpah to defend those who are drinking non-kosher wine, they decided to remove that tshuva. They just pulled it out and did not reprint it. And as a result, there were those who weren't aware of the fact that the Ramah wrote the tshuva. It's very, very fascinating. For me, the greatest lesson, even when people have a practice that perhaps does not follow the school you come from, respect them. You know, they're Torah Jews. And it is such an important message for a time where there's diversity, and we see diversity, right? We see Jews that have different practices. If you could be melamed zchus, if you have the ability to go out and say, listen, I don't follow it, I'm careful, but at the same time, I will never look down at them because perhaps they could defend what they do based on great sources. You are following the footsteps of Moshe Isserles, the value of Klal Yisrael. And in my mind, a person that merited that here we are 500 years later, many great rabbis over the years, how many of them merit that we study their words every day as we open a Shulchan Aruch, or that his responses are sitting here on shelves and being studied and analyzed and inspiring us? It is due to the fact that it respected Klal Yisrael. And you cannot enter into the industry of Jewish leadership without respecting the people of Israel and not being judgmental and looking down because they have a different practice. They do things a little bit differently. That's not Ramah-like. And for me, it's one of the very inspiring tshuvas. The greatest of all tshuvas of Ramah that tell us who this person was responsa number 125. In some editions, it's 124 because they lifted it, as I mentioned earlier. And it was an incredible story that was discussed in Krakow for hundreds of years later. And the story goes as follows. It was common that weddings were on Friday. It was the norm in European communities. I even heard in shul, when I talked about this some time ago, that some people still remember weddings on Friday. Why would you have a Friday wedding? Well, it's quite simple. The Shabbos Friday night meal was the wedding meal. And probably cheaper and logical, but that was the practice in many, many communities. So it's a Friday afternoon and they're getting ready for a wedding, but there's some bitter history as they are preparing for this wedding on Friday afternoon. The young girl gets engaged, and I say young, not a child, a normal engagement. They posted it on only Simchas Krakow.com, no question about it. So the young lady gets engaged, Mazel Tov. The father was not doing so well financially, and it appears that the father of the young lady, of the girl, was not doing so well health-wise either. And lo aleinu, he passed away after her engagement. So now there was an expectation that relatives would kick in financially, because if you want the young girl to get married, you have to pay up. The nedunya, you have to go ahead and give a dowry. So Ramah tells us, unfortunately, the krovim na'asula rechokim, those who were close, meaning relatives, they acted like foreigners. Nevertheless, even though they did not come to an agreement on financial matters, the women in the community convinced the young lady to put on her imuna, to put up her clothes, and to get ready for the wedding, because it's going to work out. So Shabbos afternoon or Friday afternoon, a couple hours into Shabbos, the young lady was all ready to go ahead and walk down to the chuppah. And as they're sitting there beforehand to work things out financially and to come to a compromise, it appears that, yes, relatives kicked in a touch, but only 66% of what was needed. Nechsar mina nedunya, you know how much was missing from the amount committed by the father? Shlish, a third. So what happened was that the Rabbonim first tried to convince family members of the Kala to give. When they were not successful, they started convincing the Chosin, and they told them, listen, don't embarrass the young lady. Money, what's money if you have the ability to go ahead and do a mitzvah, marry Yesoma? And the Chosin said, absolutely not. I'm not budging. Family members were not going to budge. All the rabbis in Krakow got involved, and they were trying to work the issue out. But the problem was that the clock was ticking and the sun set. Now, while yes, there is a minhag of having weddings on Friday, weddings on Shabbos is a violation of halacha. The Talmud tells us that you do not perform a kiddushin on Shabbos. Why? Well, there are two explanations. One explanation is that the rabbis made a decree because clearly when you have a transaction, a financial transaction, you don't do it on Shabbos because that leads to writing, which is a Torah prohibition. So too, fact is that marriage, it is a transaction. There are things that are recorded, like the Tnaim and the Ksuva. And since there are things recorded, the rabbis made a decree, no weddings are to be performed on Shabbos. So the sun set, and the fighting continued. And they couldn't come to a compromise, but it appears that after an hour and a half to two, while it's dark, I have no doubt, Krakow, right? An hour and a half after sunset, 2 hours after sunset, it is for sure dark. Finally, they settled the issue. But the problem was that you couldn't do a kiddushin on Shabbos. So the Rabbanim said, we're stuck. The Moshe Isserles got up and he says, V'shelo levayesh bat Yisrael, not to embarrass the daughter of Israel, kamti v'sidarti ha-kiddushin. He did a kiddushin on Shabbos. Other Rabbanim almost fainted. You're violating what we are told in the Talmud. So he had to defend it. And he starts off this tshuva by telling us, Va'ashma acharai kol rash gadol, that after I did it, I heard behind me these intense sounds. People were tumbling. Who is this young rabbi, right? That goes ahead and goes against halacha. And he defends himself by, number one, mentioning the fact that there is the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, that Rabbeinu Tam said that theoretically it could be done. So he relies on it. And he tells us that you should know, we are dealing here with a dochak gadol. We're dealing here with an unusual situation. Yetoma, right? She did not have a father. The busha, the shame she would have if you would not marry her off that night, right? Gadol kvoda briot. We Jews have to remember that the honor of humans is considered so great that we are willing to push aside a negative commandment of the Torah. And he says, and here you should know it's a rabbinic decree. And he adds the following. This is a fascinating analysis of Moshe Isserles. Do you know that according to Talmudic literature, on Shabbos, you're not supposed to clap? Not supposed to clap. And even till today, there are people that clap in unusual way to avoid that issue. Nevertheless, I've been to many, many wonderful shuls where people are clapping away on Shabbos. Right? I was in Milwaukee in Rabbi Twersky shul. Every Shabbos, boy, you better clap if you want to be on the good side of Rabbi Twersky, because that was the minhag. So what happened? So there is a statement that was made by the great rabbis in France, Baalei Tosfot, in the early 12th century, who say that you should know many of the rabbinic decrees, when times change, the rabbis did not have in mind future generations, meaning the rabbis made a decree not to clap because when you clap, you'll pull out a musical instrument. A musical instrument requires fixing continuously. Nowadays, that our musical instruments are different, that we do not continuously fix, so therefore the decree does not apply. This is what the Baalei Tosfot tells us. Notes the Ramah that you should know. When the rabbis made a decree that marriages are not to take place on Shabbat, that was at a time that the chassan would sit down and write out his own documents. Today, the documents are not written by the chassan, and they're not even done at the wedding. It is hours before, in some cases days before, they write out the t'naim and the ksuva. So therefore, he argues the decree does not apply. And he says, although all this is a new insight and we would not rely on it in usual circumstances, here we're dealing with a shat, hatchak, we're dealing here with a situation where there are emotions, where there's shame, where there's a yisoma. I am quite proud of what I achieved and what I did in this situation. That's what Moshe Isserles tells us. I found an authority from a few hundred years later. In other words, this is taking place in the middle of the 16th century. And I find an authority from the middle of the 19th century, so we're talking about 300 years later, that tells us that you should know many rabbis in Krakow did not agree with the Ramah. And as a result of the big tumult that it caused, they established from that point on that there should not be chuppah v'kiddushim b'yom shishi po b'Krakow. To avoid such issues in the future, they established a system where weddings are not to be in Krakow on Friday. Now, he tells us that in a situation where they have to be on Friday, so they go outside. They had a suburb that they would turn to. That's what we are told about the Ramah and this story. I mentioned earlier that David sent a few pictures, and just to read for you his matzeva that David and Fran Wolf tell us, Ro'eh in Israel, biyom gal lemispar bnei Israel, on the day of Gal. So the Ramah passed away in the year 1572, and it was on the day of Lag BaOmer. So therefore we have it here that it was Biyom Gal, lemispar bnei Israel, Gala kevod me Israel, honor from Israel, was exiled. Moshe haya roetzon Israel. He was the guide of the flock of Israel. Tzidkot Hashem asau mishpat leIsrael. He was a guide in justice. He irbitz Torah beIsrael. He'emi talmidim revavot alafim. It is the Aleph Lamed goes together, which in a lot of old Chumashim and Sidurim you would see it. And then they said regarding him, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lokam ke Moshe beIsrael. They said this regarding Rambam, and they said regarding the Ramah. And he was an author of a work called Torat Chatat, Torat Ha'olah, and up until today, people have the privilege of visiting this location. The burial site of the Ramah became a location for hundreds of years. Jews would make their way on Lag BaOmer for their Lag BaOmer trip to Krakow, to this location. I read somewhere that the Polish train company actually had a reduced rates for travelers on Lag BaOmer. to make their way to visit the Ramah. So that's a legacy. And until today, you could visit the shul, from my understanding. I don't know if I'm running back there or not. That's a different discussion. But I have no doubt that the Ramah appreciates the fact that we study his works. We are inspired by him. And there is a statement that was made by a few. Sometimes there are disputes among later authorities if you follow the Ramah or not. So there's a saying that Ubnei Yisrael Yotzim Biyad Ramah. That obviously is talking about the Exodus, but it's applied to the Ramah as well. We, the children of Israel, could feel confident in following insights of the Ramah. So two questions here are asked. Number one, it is forbidden to clap or dance on Shabbos and Yom Tov. The Gemara explains that this is a rabbinic prohibition in order to prevent the person from coming to fix a musical instrument. That's correct. And therefore, the Tosfos is a chiddush. Now, there's a legend regarding how old the Ramah was when he died. There are many legends. There's a legend which is completely untrue that he died at age 33. And the legend is that Ramah died at age 33 on Lag BaOmer, and it was the year 33, meaning they thought he died in the year Shin Lamed Gimel, and he wrote 33 books. So this is just a legend. The Ramah was not 33 when he died, he was older. Then there are those who believe, and I think David mentions here, that he died at age 42. It's unclear. It appears that the Ramah was at least 48 when he passed away, at least 48, perhaps a touch older. And the reason we know it is that his responsa, his significant responsa that was written regarding the controversy of the printers in Venice was written in the year 1550. And he at the time already was the head of the Krakow based in. Logically, he was 25 at the time, perhaps even 30. And he lived 22 years afterwards. So the Ramah either lived 48 years, 47, 8 years, or even 52 years. So he was young, especially the way we see it today. But obviously his accomplishments are incredible, whatever age he did indeed depart this world. So we thank again to our sponsors. Thank you, Shulim, and the Neshama, your father, have an aliyah. I thank you all for participating. And if anyone does have any insight or statement, you're welcome to go ahead and share.